Welcome back to the study. We're still here in Mark chapter 4. We've been looking at these parables for several sessions, and there's really no reason to rush through them. We talk through them a little bit at a time. Each one of our sessions is about 6 to 8 or 9 minutes long, so it's not hard to get caught up if you want to. Welcome. We're at the parable of the mustard seed in verse 30. Pardon me, it's early morning, and I enjoy studying in the early morning hours, so you're getting a little bit of the benefit of that voice not being broke in yet for the day. Verse 30 of Mark chapter 4, he said, "How shall we picture the kingdom of God? Or by what parable shall we present it?" He goes on to say, "It is like a mustard seed, which has sown upon the soil. Though it is smaller than all the seeds that are upon the soil, yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes larger than all of the garden plants and forms large branches, so that the birds of the air can nest under its shade." That's a quote out of Jeremiah chapter 17, by the way. With many such parables, he was speaking the word to them, so far as they were able to hear it. And he did not speak to them without a parable, but he was explaining everything privately to his own disciples. Well, this is really a neat story when you understand the culture, especially the agriculture of Jesus' day there in Palestine. This is real easy for us to kind of just say, yeah, that's neat, okay, whatever, let's get on with it. But when you understand what he was saying to them, and in their particular place in the world and the way they did agricultural farming, it really was an interesting story. He talks about this small seed. When you look at a mustard seed, and when you can buy them on the store, they are somewhat similar to the ones he would have been referring to, maybe a little different species. But if you take a mustard seed, a real tiny one, and you break it open, you'll find little pebbles in it, little smaller seeds in it. That's kind of interesting, because that's the way the church is. That's the way we see ourselves many times, as a collection of little churches that make the universal church. Again, the kingdom of God isn't just that seed. It's not just the church. It's more than that, and we see how this works out. But it is a product that comes from that God plants into the earth. And of course, Jesus planted his church. We see that very clearly when he talked to Peter in Matthew 16. And he said to Peter, he said, "Upon the rock of revelation, and that I am the Christ, I am the promised Messiah." Jesus says, you learn that from the Spirit. And upon that truth, that's how this church will get built. And that's a very interesting concept. And he used men like Peter to build that church. Okay, and that's the neat concept too. There's a parallel interpretation there in Matthew 16 that we don't have time to get into, but that's really unique if you look at that. Well, it's interesting because this small seed goes in the ground, and what happened in the Palestinian gardens and farms is they planted the mustard on the edge of their fields, on the edge of their gardens, because if they planted it in the middle of the field in rows, it would be impossible to harvest. It would be impossible to take care of. So they would put it on the edges of their gardens, on the edges of their fields, and these big bushy plants would come forth and, of course, reproduce product, what we now know to be probably more like oregano than mustard, but within the same family of plants. And this bushy plant would grow out of these tiny seeds, and unless it was trimmed back, unless it was cut and harvested back a little bit, or it would thinned out, it would take over the garden. It would just come over, and of course it provided this shadow effect that the birds would come under and nest. Now think about that. When birds come in and nest in something, what is the, shall we say, the byproduct of that? It's manure. And it kills plants, and it's not good for your plants. So they had to cut it back. Now, this is a picture of the kingdom of God. he says. And what the neat part about it is the only way the kingdom of God gets cut back any at all is by the world, because it will come in and it will eventually take over the world, which is a promise in eschatology that we can hang on to. There will be a new heaven, a new earth, and it will be covered with the kingdom of God. It will be overshadowed by the kingdom of God. And it is overshadowed by the kingdom of God to a certain extent. We believe that we live in the kingdom of God presently by the Spirit, not by the flesh, but by the Spirit. And that is a wonderful way to look at life. So many people look at the kingdoms of this world and get frustrated, and we all do. But the real kingdom of God overshadows us in the spiritual sense, and we live under that protective umbrella. And that's very neat. There's a lot of different angles, as you can see, to this parable. And in 7, 8, 10 minutes, I can't go there with all of them. But you can start the process by listening, and then by digging and going in there and checking it out for yourself and reading that even more as God speaks to your heart in the Spirit. Now, he talks about all of this, and he refers to this garden environment and how this mustard plant must get cut back, must be, and some of that could even deal with the persecution of the church, and we understand that to be part of this. Again, a very multifaceted parable, being cut back so that it doesn't take over the world, at least at this point. And that is something that is very unique. God has made the kingdom of God to be bigger than anything else. In comparative, it started out very small with Jesus Christ and basically, a dozen or so guys who took that gospel after Jesus ascended around the world, and it became the kingdom of God in which the church was active and became what it is today. A lot of people will ask me, well, when you use the word church in the kingdom of God, what are you referring to there? Is that Protestantism? Is that Catholicism? Is that Orthodoxy, National Orthodoxy? What is that? Well, it isn't any of those, but yet it's all of those, because it's those who accept that great love and salvation from God through Christ and live that life out. And that means we do the Christian life, not just believe it. We're saved by believing, because that's how we place our faith in it. But we do it too. And the doing is important. And it is the byproduct of the believing. And that's the beauty of that. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Jesus goes on to say, with many, and the writer here, Mark says, go on to say, with many parables, that he was speaking the word, and that is the living word, that is the truth of God, to them, as far as they were able to hear it, or as far as they could understand it. And he used these parables because people connected in their culture and their society with the parables. In a sense, it was culturally relevant. I don't like that term to be used because it's so abused in the church today, and it's so radically compromising. But Jesus was being, to a certain point here, culturally relevant in the way he presented the kingdom of God, the message of Christ in this whole scenario. And then it goes on to say, but he was explaining everything privately to his own disciples. In other words, he took them aside and gave them what he figured they weren't getting, because at this point in their lives, they were maybe a step or two ahead of the general public because they were with Christ more than the general public was. But they were still learning and growing. I talk about it. These guys went to Jesus Seminary 3 years, and they graduated still somewhat ignorant. We all do. I've had several years of training and education in seminaries and Bible colleges, and still learning. We all do. And it's great when Jesus sits down and gives us the nitty-gritty of what he's saying. And he needs to do that. And that's where we today listen by the Spirit as we read the Word, because, as Paul said, the Spirit of God teaches us, and that's important. It's a very interesting parable. As you can see, it's like a gemstone. You can look at it from many different facets in many different ways and find that truth. And that is the parable of the mustard seed.